So I'm going to talk about intimacy, or just treat it over literally. But I'm going to think not so much about the larger social sphere, which is what Elizabeth did, but I'm going to think about it more in the consulting room. And so to frame the discussion, I want to just set up two questions. And it's this. Is intimacy a necessary ingredient to the therapy, for the therapy to be therapeutic? Or is the presence of intimacy a corruption to the work of therapy, the presence of which stops the therapy being therapeutic? But first of all, just what is intimacy? Well, my associations, it has to do with closeness, proximity, connection, union, touch. It has to do with openness, vulnerability, intensity, depth. It is a state in which the barriers of shame come down and perhaps disappear entirely, so there is transparency. Intimacy has more to do with being rather than doing. And sexual union is perhaps the epitome of intimacy, but often enough, sexual union is anything but intimate. In contrast to the intensity of sexual union, there is another version of intimacy, which is akin to Winnicott's infant playing alone in the presence of mother. Two or more people sitting together, but each absorbed in their own task, be it reading or knitting or whatever. My associations with that kind of picture are those of warmth, ease, peace, and comfort. The look between mother and child is another sort of epitome. But here too, one has to say, not always. Sometimes the mother looks at the child with dead eyes, to use the phrase alluded to by Elizabeth Orr. Key to the experience of intimacy, I think, it must be some kind of reciprocity and mutuality. And those two words are going to be important. But we should not leave out the other, more fractious side of intimacy, wherein one feels no inhibition in expressions of irritation or annoyance. With the shame barrier down, the censor is largely absent. We witness these aspects of intimacy within couples, siblings, and close friends. The repercussions of the expressions of irritations create distance and can provoke expressions of irritation in turn. So, should that kind of a phenomenon still be called intimacy? I'll put that question aside for the moment and come back to it a bit later. So, the aspect of intimacy that I've been fleshing out is a deep form of involvement. And I also notice that I've been drawn to use the word deep repeatedly in trying to capture something about the notion of intimacy. But what does our lecturer, Fuchs lecturer Elizabeth Orr, have to say on these matters? On the one hand, she mentions Freud approvingly to say that psychoanalysis is primarily a psychological theory and research method, and only in second place a therapeutic practice. This, of course, is true of group analysis as well. Well, if it is indeed the case that group analysis is primarily a theory and research method, then it doesn't sound like it would be a very promising environment for the fostering of intimacy. And yet, our Fuchs lecturer concluded her presentation with the rousing words, "I am convinced that group analysis is capable to offer what is increasingly missing in society, a place to experience intimacy, coherence, and cohesion." So, here we have a tension that arises out of the perennial questions that we all return to time and time again. Just what is group analysis? Just what is psychotherapy? Are they even the same thing? Well, on these matters, as a profession, we are profoundly divided. The fundamental division for some is the division between analysis and psychotherapy. There are many psychoanalysts and also group analysts who would say that the profession of the analyst is distinct from that of the therapist. Analysis, they would claim, is the search for truth, a value-free research into the psyche of the patient. The alleviation of suffering is delegated to the therapist. Now, in speaking to you, of necessity, I have to make assumptions about where you stand on this division and other divisions. And this makes my task complicated. On the one hand, I don't want to inflict on you the tedium of rehearsing ancient arguments, but nor do I want to inflict on you the arrogant presumption that all right-thinking people must think like me. So as I speak, I need to make some assumptions, which at times might come across to you as unwarranted presumptions about what you think and where you stand. If so, sorry. Now, our Fuchs lecturer tells us a number of things about where she stands and where she thinks that the group analyst stands, on the edge. She calls on the authority of Fuchs, who has said of the group analyst, to be at the same time inside and outside the group, to be a participant observer. She goes on to say that this means to be involved emotionally, but not in action, and to maintain at the same time the capacity to be an adamant observer. It is a position in between. It does not allow purity or objectivity or absolute truth. It allows us to take part and at the same time stay an observer. This kind of research methodology, which privileges subjectivity, is very different from Freud's view of psychoanalysts as researcher. His version was grounded in a 19th century version of science, in which the relation between the observer and observed was straightforward and unproblematic. Crucially, in that view, it presumed that the analyst should be and ought to be the detached observer and commentator of psychic phenomena. Central to this position is the notion of value-free neutrality, of non-interference, of reason purged of emotion. And this gives rise to the iconic image of the impassive, blank-screen psychoanalyst as scientist. The distinction is important because although Elizabeth Rohr relies on the authority of Freud to legitimate the principle of research, she practices a form of research that is very different from the one envisaged by Freud, and perhaps would be anathema to him. The distinction is also important for the following reason. The removed stance of the classical psychoanalyst is predicated on the belief that the driver of social life is to be found entirely in the internal workings of the psyches of individuals, and the patient's experiences of the external world are said to be born of projections from the internal world. The scientist-analyst reads backwards from the manifest to make inferences about the internal, and the analyst keeps themselves out of the picture in order not to contaminate the data. And if the analyst does find themselves engaging in a conversation with the patient about the external world, then they are thought to have capitulated, acted out, and lost the plot in some way. Now, many contemporary psychoanalysts continue to embody this stance. In my experience, it is also the belief system of many group analysts who might speak the rhetoric of the social, but whose practice deifies the internal psychological, and whose stance and attitude is that of a detached observer of clinical events. Now, when I say this kind of thing, mostly I meet protest. I'm told we don't believe that sort of thing anymore. I'm also sometimes told, well, that is how it might be in psychoanalysis, but it certainly is not so in group analysis, if only because the analyst is more visible and exposed to group members. I beg to differ. Just recently, I was in a group experience, during which the conductor of the group looked steadfastly at the floor for the entire 90 minutes, and said nothing apart from one interpretation towards the end of a session. In contrast to the idea of the detached researcher, Elizabeth Rohr tells us, and here I agree with her, that there is no way to observe a human being without being involved, and there is no valid description of any situation without describing the interaction between the observed and the observer. But, despite promoting the view that the researcher is necessarily embedded in the research, Elizabeth Rohr thinks, and this is something I don't agree with, that it is possible to inhabit the edge in such a way that it is possible to be involved emotionally but not in action. how is it possible to be involved and not act? It seems to me that this stance is made to appear possible by creating a split between mind and body, between thought and action, a split that does not exist in lived reality. And I think this belief is commonplace in our profession. Well, rather importantly, Elizabeth Raw describes the interactions that take place during the research, whether it be in the field or the clinic, as transferences and countertransferences. And this, when I read this, it raised for me the following interesting question. Are all the interactions and experiences that take place between protagonists in a therapy to be construed as versions of transference and countertransference? Is everything transference and countertransference? And I find myself asking this because in the way that we usually talk of the transference and countertransference, they are sort of counterfeit experiences. And I use the word counterfeit to point to the belief that a transference experience is one which in a sense is not quite real, and its sources are not in the present, but in another time and another place. And the sources of the analyst's feelings are called countertransference, which being a response to the transference are tarred with the same brush. It is not that the experience is imagined or false, rather the experience, although tangible and real, is a distortion of how things really are. And it's a commonplace phenomenon, and we all know it well, and here's an ordinary enough illustration. Last week in a group, during a silence that had gone on for a minute or two, John says to Jane, "Why have you stopped speaking?" She had not noticed that she had drifted off, and the question brings her back to the group. She says that as she was speaking, she noticed me put my hand to my head, and this she took to mean that I was bored, and she stopped speaking. I was not bored, but stirred by what she was saying. Well, the opposite of counterfeit is authentic, and the opposite of distorted is accurate. And this tells us that the opposite of the transference is some idea of objectivity, of reality. Here then is another question. If all the experiences taking place in the clinic are manifestations of transference and countertransference, then can they ever be said to be authentic? Well, we must think so, else we would not be doing this work. But this also tells us that we've made too sharp a distinction between the transference and objectivity. This also tells us that the classical psychoanalytic position is immersed in a version of positivism in which the external reality is an apolitical, unproblematic giving. Here, in contrast to the transferential world of the patient, the analyst has the privilege of living in a region called reality. Well, if intimacy has to do with mutuality and reciprocity, then in this kind of detached analytic situation, not only will intimacy not be possible, it will also be construed of as a corruption to the analyst's objectivity and his or her allegiance to the truth. Now, in contrast to that point of view, I think that most of us in this room might agree that as humans, we are always mired in subjectivity. We are always in the thick of things. So if we recast the transference simply as experience, as it has been patterned by one's history, then one cannot make a sharp distinction between reality and transference, either in the clinic or out there in the ordinary world. And all this is as true of the analyst as much as it is the patient. And although most would concur with this viewpoint in principle, in practice, things are often very different. Sometimes we can catch glimpses of just how different by observing how our training institutions engage with their trainees and the ways that various panels treat their interviewees and so on. Often enough, the stance is authoritarian between the ones who know and the ones who have to show. And if there is a difference and dispute between the ones who know and the ones who have to show, the problem is located in the ones who have to show. But if we follow, as we've been invited to do by Elizabeth, if we follow the relational, the intersubjectivist, the hermeneutic, and the ethnomethodological turns, then we would wholeheartedly agree with the Fuchs lecturer that there is no way to observe a human being without being involved, and there is no valid description of any situation without describing the interaction between the observed and the observer. But if this is indeed the case, that the observer and observed are entangled, then I think it's a bit of a fantasy to imagine that the therapist can be involved emotionally, but not in action. After all, Elizabeth did buy food for those she was researching. Obviously, Elizabeth was active, and momentarily something therapeutic occurred because of the activity. And I think as a profession, or our profession, is inclined to sustain the fantasy of non-action because of its aspiration to be viewed in the same light as the natural sciences. I would say that this kind of detached stance is the analyst's way of defending against the experience of intimacy. And how could they not? All the connotations of intimacy, reciprocity, transparency, exposure, are undermining of the very idea of detachment that the analyst holds so dear. Now, Fuchs himself was well on the road in these matters. He said, "It is important for the therapist to admit that his personal influence is inevitably strong in spite of his precautions to minimize this. Therefore, he should use it consciously rather than haphazardly or unconsciously." In my Fuchs lecture, I argued for something similar, for the virtues of a responsive therapist rather than a removed one. In my view, not only is intimacy possible between therapist and patient, but that it is necessary, and I construe of therapy as a journey towards growing intimacy. Fuchs himself provided us with two terms that speak to the analyst-therapist divide: a group analyst and group conductor. The task of the analyst is to interpret, and the task of the conductor is to facilitate. About the conductor, Fuchs says this: interpretations are only one kind of intervention which fall to the lot of the conductor. He may sometimes have to select a topic to draw attention to what the group is trying to gloss over. He may have to confront people, explain links, address individuals of the group. He may ask questions, ask for information, and so forth. Now, when I began supervising training groups of the IGA many years ago, in the early days, in my report on one of the trainees, I said that while she did a lot of facilitating, she did not interpret much. When I said this, I was making a criticism. I now think the opposite. I think facilitation to be more important than interpretation. Why? Because the task is to deepen communication. Of course, interpretations too deepen communication, but not when they are obscure, enigmatic, and delivered by an opaque analyst from a great height. On these occasions, mostly the effect is to silence and to bewilder, effects which are then pathologized. But the two positions between analyst and conductor are not as distinct as they are usually made out to be. And I think with these two terms, Fuchs, like Elias, is struggling with the paradox that we are both detached and involved at the same time. So when I think about what does the activity of conducting mean to me in my day-to-day practice, this is what I found myself writing. At its most straightforward, I take conducting to mean drawing attention to. At its simplest, I take conducting to mean noticing. At its most practical, I take conducting to be the act of speaking in order to draw attention to. One can see then that the conducting is not particularly mysterious, esoteric, or arcane. Now let me turn to analysis and its main instrument, the interpretation. Now, it's the interpretation is said to be something very distinct and different from education, advice, information giving, and so forth. So I'm going to, so Fuchs cites this interpretation, which he says that it is the kind of interpretation he would not make. And so this is, he's supervising somebody. So the person's patient, having admitted that she masturbated, she comes to the next session with her fingernails painted red, and she is expressing revulsion at the thought of having been breastfed. So, as I say, this is the kind of interpretation Fuchs would not make. So I interpreted to her how she felt the breast was revolting, because she felt that she had torn it to bits with her nails, which were stained with blood. She asked me not to say things like that, as they terrified her, and I interpreted that she felt terrified of this torn breast, and so on. Now, leaving aside any questions of accuracy or effectiveness, the accuracy or effectiveness of this interpretation, the issue I want to flag up is this. In what sense is this or any other interpretation not just simply an explanation? In what sense is it not educative? In what sense is it simply not just telling the patient how things stand and why that is so? I think in seeking to distinguish the interpretation from information and education, it has been made a mysterious and mythic form of communication, an incantation. An incantation with magical properties. In what is apparently potent about it is not what we actually see, its informational and educative content, but apparently some other quality. And often, the interpretation is made to appear objective by being spoken in the third person. But the distinction between facilitation and interpretation is quite undermined by Fuchs when he reminds us that the original German term used by Freud for interpretation was Deutung. And in German, all this means is to point to. To point to. And this has very different connotations than the mystification that it has become in the English language. Fuchs says, the broader meaning of interpretation is to draw a person's attention to another meaning of the line of thought or action he is pursuing. But this is exactly how I described my experience of conducting earlier. In other words, both interpretation and facilitation are simply ways of drawing attention to something, and necessarily in the same moment drawing attention away from something else. It is a directing activity. It is for these reasons that rather than speak of therapy in terms of facilitation or analysis, like many others, I prefer to think of therapy as conversation. A conversation that is emergent and is being co-created by all the participants, including the therapist. So I'm going to come back now to the theme of intimacy. The conversation in the final large group at the conclusion of a 2-day workshop was warm and appreciative. Participants expressed gratitude to each other as well as the conveners. After a while, one of the conveners said something about this being the honeymoon period, and if we were to continue, we were bound to encounter more difficult feelings towards each other. He asked, where are the critical, disappointed experiences? The group has been told that by focusing on the positive, it is being avoidant. Further, that the feelings aroused during the honeymoon phase are not real, but born of projection and fantasy. Honeymoons are states in which idealization prevails. Whilst there's no doubt some truth in this viewpoint, it is not all true, and there is more going on than meets this convener's eye. I think that the convener is uncomfortable precisely because of the feelings of intimacy prevailing in the room, and in speaking in this way at this moment, he spoils something. This sort of moment, of course, is not unfamiliar to us. Humour is regularly interpreted as manic avoidance and so forth. Here's another moment. During a workshop last year on ethics at the IGA, We were showing a small fragment, a small bit of an episode of a TV series of drama on therapy. So in the segment we're shown that the therapist is in supervision and talking about a very difficult situation he finds himself in. And the clip ends at in a moment of emotional intensity, with the supervisor saying to the therapist something like, "I will stay with you whatever happens." What was interesting to me was the reaction in the room. There was a consensus between the people that spoke up that the supervisor had collapsed, had capitulated. The tone of the comments was somewhat superior, scornful, and pitying of the supervisor. I don't doubt that in all these instances there are avoidances and so on in play. What I object to is the formulaic way in which moments of burgeoning intimacy are continually and relentlessly interpreted as pathological, as pairing, as manic flight into positivity, and so on. I think this kind of ritualistic assault on good feelings in the room is in many cases born of envy in the therapist. I think on these occasions the therapist cannot bear the invitation to intimacy, perhaps, and here I speculate, perhaps because it threatens their allegiance to the stance of the detached therapist. And as we know, the function of envy is to spoil and destroy. To end with, I just want to go back to the group session I mentioned earlier. Harry had visited his aging parents. He said that his relationship to them was much improved. Things were much closer, and he now knew that they loved him. Martha asks him, "How do you know they love you?" He ponders, thinks a while, and says, "I don't think they've ever said the words 'I love you' to me. But even as a child, but I can infer from the way they are that they do." Others resonate with the theme and elaborate with their own associations. Whilst this is going on, it occurs to me that in this group an awful lot of inferring goes on. There's very little direct communication between persons about how they actually experience and feel towards each other. I say this. It evokes a kind of panic mixed with excitement. And although this group is caring, thoughtful and reflective, and can feel quite safe and cozy, there's actually no intimacy in it. They attend to each other, they help each other, but they don't dare to respond to each other. In this way, to some degree, their communications, being so sanitized, are barren. They do not dare express their fondness and warmth for each other, and nor do they dare to express their irritations and frustrations. It is as though the tap is turned off at the mains, and so neither hot nor cold water can flow. The conversation now segues into the themes of the fear of exposure, of being judged, of being wrong, of potential shame if they were to dare to let themselves to be seen, of humiliation and reprimand if they would dare to let any of their responses, negative or positive, become known. Well, to me, this kind of struggle is what group psychotherapy is all about. In this work, I see my task as helping bring down the threshold of shame in order that intimacy might start to flourish. One of the ways I do this is to allow myself to be transparent to some degree, to let some of my responses be visible, not thoughtlessly, but circumspectly. I risk getting egg on my face, and often enough do so. In proceeding in this way, I aspire to be like the psychoanalyst Harold Searles, who wrote this after 30 years of practice. I feel increasingly free to interact, whether in subjectively loving or subjectively malevolent manner, with my patients. I would no longer find it necessary to inveigh quite so strongly against love replacement therapy as I did then, and would no longer take pains to caution, as I did there, that it is well for the therapist to maintain a degree of emotional distance between himself and that patient. Now, I find a generous place in psychotherapy for all the sadism I can muster. For example, to needle and infuriate the apathetic or out-of-contact patient into more overt relatedness, or to pay him back for the hurts he has been inflicting on me. With an abundance of this kind of interaction between us, he has good reason to know that I am in no wise a saint, and we can deal with his own problems about sadism in a person-to-person fashion. This, it seems to me, is quite a good description of what intimacy in the consulting room might look like, and one that as a profession we might aspire to. Thanks.